Chapter 1. In the 5th year of her marriage to Gerald Ramos, Paula learned that he had recovered his memory. She picked up her phone and called her employer. "Your divorce certificate from Gerald will be processed within a month. When the time comes, I'll hand you the visa as well." Holding the phone, Paula replied to the person on the other end with polite distance. "I understand. Thank you, Mrs. Ramos." The woman hesitated for a moment. "Have you really thought it through? Do you truly want to divorce him?" Paula lowered her gaze slightly, her long lashes casting a faint shadow over her eyes. "Mrs. Ramos, we had an agreement from the beginning. As long as I became pregnant with a child of the Ramos family, I would be free to leave him. In that case, once you go abroad and give birth to the child, we'll consider the deal completely settled." Not long after the call ended, a transfer notification appeared on Paula's phone. 1 billion. And that didn't even include the final payment. It was enough to last her a lifetime. Suddenly, a deep male voice sounded behind her. "Who were you talking to?" Paula's heart tightened. She turned around and saw Gerald standing in the bedroom. She had no idea when he had walked in, dressed in a sharp suit. He looked tall, handsome, and effortlessly noble. Paula smiled without revealing anything. "A friend." Gerald glanced at what she was holding. "What's that in your hand?" "A plan for our 5th wedding anniversary." Paula folded up the pregnancy test report she had been clutching and handed it toward him. "Do you want to take a look?" Gerald didn't move. His expression was complicated. "Cancel this year's anniversary. I don't have time recently." But half a month ago, he had already cleared his schedule for the anniversary. 10 days ago, the two of them had still been happily planning how to celebrate it this year. His phone suddenly rang when Gerald saw the caller ID. The long, narrow eyes that usually looked distant softened noticeably. "I have something to deal with. No need to wait for me for dinner tonight." With that, he tossed out the words, answered the call, and strode away. Watching his retreating back, Paula felt as if countless needles were piercing her heart, sharp, suffocating pain spreading through her chest. For 5 years, she and Gerald Ramos had been inseparable, deeply in love, until 5 days ago. Everything changed. She didn't know where he had found Susie's photo, but the moment he saw her face, his memories suddenly came back, the memories of the woman who had always been his one true love. Paula had vaguely heard about them before. Gerald and Susie had once been a perfect match, but 5 years ago, Susie's family had invited Gerald Ramos's father to go camping with them. Unexpectedly, they were kidnapped by an extremist anti-rich criminal with violent tendencies. In order to survive, Susie's family exposed the identity of Gerald's father as the richest man in South City. The extremist brutally murdered and dismembered him. The Ramos family flew into a thunderous rage. They spared no cost to ensure the killer suffered a punishment 10 times more horrific. Susie's parents also died quietly in prison. Only Susie was protected by Gerald Ramos. On the day Susie was forcibly sent abroad by the old matriarch of the Ramos family, Gerald desperately chased after her by car and ended up in a serious accident. When he woke up, he had forgotten everything. That was when Mrs. Ramos approached Paula and proposed a deal. At the time, Paula didn't know any of the inside story. She even joked that Mrs. Ramos must be so desperate for a grandchild that she had lost her mind. Mrs. Ramos said to her then, "You don't understand how important Susie is in Gerald's heart. Any woman can marry into the Ramos family and give birth to a Ramos child, but Susie is the one woman who absolutely cannot." Over the years, in order to prevent Gerald and Susie from ever reconnecting, Mrs. Ramos acted with ruthless efficiency. Not only did she erase every trace of Susie's existence, she also made it known throughout the social circle. Anyone in South City who dared to mention Susie again would be making an enemy of the Ramos family. For 5 peaceful years, nothing happened. Yet Gerald still recovered his memory. The moment he remembered everything, he almost immediately flew overseas. Just yesterday, Paula discovered she was pregnant and learned that he had returned to the country. She rushed to the airport to pick him up, but what she saw was him walking out of the VIP passageway, holding a woman's hand. She followed his car all the way and discovered that Gerald had not only brought Susie back from abroad, but had also arranged for her to live in a secluded villa under his name. Watching him carefully hide Susie away, Paula felt her heart sink to the bottom. At that moment, she knew it was time for her to leave. Chapter 2. In the bedroom, Paula sorted through everything Gerald had given her over the past 5 years. She left the expensive handbags and jewelry untouched, but told the housemaid to throw away everything else. Holding up a glass jar filled with folded paper stars, the maid asked, "Young madam, do you want to throw these away too?" The colorful paper stars were something Paula had taught Gerald to fold back when he was hospitalized after his car accident. She remembered how he had been after losing his memory, violent, temperamental, impossible for anyone to approach. The moment she had pushed open the hospital room door, he smashed a cup against her forehead and told her to get out. Blood immediately streamed down from her forehead, yet she neither got angry nor upset. Instead, she gently asked if he had hurt his hand. With the most patient and tender side of herself, she taught him how to fold paper stars, accompanied him through rehabilitation, massaged his head whenever his headaches flared up, told him stories when he couldn't sleep, and even personally cooked nutritious meals for him, never repeating the same dishes for an entire week. She handled every detail tirelessly, without complaint, until finally he softened and accepted her. She still remembered the day he was discharged from the hospital, holding a full jar of paper stars. He knelt on one knee in front of her. "I told myself that every time I loved you a little more, I'd fold another star. When the jar was full, I'd propose to you. Now the jar is full. Paula, will you marry me?" Back then, he had been sincere and deeply affectionate, his eyes filled with tender love that had reached its peak. The 5 years of their marriage afterward had been so blissful that it felt like a dream. And now, the dream had to end. Paula said calmly to the maid, "Throw them away." "All right." Late that night, just as Paula had lain down, she suddenly received a call from the Ramos family's butler. "Young madam, the young master is being punished by kneeling in the ancestral hall by madam. Please come back and persuade her." Paula quickly changed clothes and rushed to the Ramos family's old mansion. From the butler, she learned that although Gerald had secretly brought Susie back to the country, he still hadn't managed to hide it from Mrs. Ramos. Mrs. Ramos had people capture Susie, and Gerald rushed back to the Ramos mansion to plead for her. Inside the ancestral hall, Mrs. Ramos was furious. "You actually dared to secretly bring that woman back. Have you no respect for your father's spirit in heaven? The one who harmed Dad was Susie's parents. They've already paid the price. Susie is innocent. The daughter of criminals dares to speak of innocence? She shares the blame for your father's death. By defending her like this, you're not only betraying your father, you're also betraying Paula, who has stayed by your side all these years." Gerald frowned for a moment, his tone filled entirely with protection for Susie. "Susie has suffered enough abroad all these years. I can't just abandon her." Mrs. Ramos's voice sharpened. "So you're determined to protect her no matter what? If you still refuse to let Susie go, then I will atone in her place. I'm willing to accept the family punishment, just please release her and stop making things difficult for her." Paula was stunned by his words. She had never imagined he would go this far for Susie. Mrs. Ramos was so angry she almost fainted. "Do you even know that Paula's she? Mom." Just as Mrs. Ramos was about to blurt out the truth about Paula's pregnancy, Paula's face changed instantly and she cut her off in a hurry. She walked over and forced a smile, trying to calm her. "Everything can be discussed. Please don't get angry, it's not worth harming your health." Only then did Mrs. Ramos suddenly realize that if Gerald learned Paula was pregnant, the man who had now recovered his memory might never allow her to keep the child. Mrs. Ramos swallowed the words that had reached her lips and instead asked Gerald sharply, "So you truly want Susie to willingly accept the family punishment?" Gerald answered without hesitation, "Yes." "Fine, then I'll grant your wish." The Ramos family punishment was extremely severe, 100 lashes. By the end, Gerald's skin was torn open, bright red blood soaked through his white shirt, his back a horrifying mess of torn flesh. Throughout the entire ordeal, he gritted his teeth and never made a sound, until he lost nearly half his life and finally fainted from blood loss. After the punishment ended, the unconscious Gerald was sent to the hospital. Paula stayed by his bedside day and night, taking care of him. The next day, a woman forced her way into the hospital room. Paula had just turned around when a sudden slap landed across her face. Susie glared at her and demanded angrily, "Aren't you Gerald's wife? You were there when he was being punished. How could you just stand there and watch him get beaten half to death without begging for mercy? How can you be so heartless?" Chapter 3. Paula almost didn't hesitate. She raised her hand and slapped Susie back. If it weren't for you, would he have received that family punishment? What right do you have to question me for not pleading for him? Susie had never expected her to strike back. She froze for a moment, then became even angrier. Paula, Gerald has treated you so well these past few years. Is this how you repay him? Then what do you expect me to do? She had wanted to plead for him, but he had willingly accepted the punishment for the daughter of the people responsible for his father's death. How could she possibly bring herself to beg for mercy in that situation? Susie accused her furiously. I really didn't expect you to be so cold-hearted. You don't deserve to be with him at all. Paula sneered. If I don't deserve to be with him, does the daughter of his family's enemy deserve it? Enough. Gerald had woken up at some point without them noticing. Susie's eyes instantly filled with tears. She rushed into his arms, crying, Gerald, you're finally awake. Do you know how badly you scared me? Gerald gently patted her back and spoke softly. Did my mother make things difficult for you again? Susie shook her head while crying. After you took the family punishment, Mrs. Ramos ordered someone to release me. Gerald let out a breath of relief. That's good. Mrs. Ramos had probably let Susie go because she didn't want things to become too ugly between her and her only son. Gerald allowed Susie to cling to him despite the wounds covering his body. The scene made them look like a loving couple. Meanwhile, Paula seemed like the outsider who didn't belong there at all. A heavy dullness pressed against Paula's heart. At the same time, the black mandala tattoo on her ankle seemed to burn with a sharp, piercing pain. Without saying a word, she turned and left the hospital room. Gerald stayed in the hospital for several days, and Susie remained in the room with him the entire time. Paula was tactful enough not to appear unnecessarily and disturb them. She hired a nurse to take care of him every day. The housemaid delivered his 3 meals, and she would also inform Paula about his recovery. One day, while Paula was focused on drawing a design draft, she received a call from Mrs. Ramos. Mrs. Ramos asked about the condition of the baby in her womb. The doctor said everything looks good. There aren't any problems. Paula replied, you need to pay attention to nutrition. If anything happens, inform me immediately. All right. Mrs. Ramos fell silent for a moment before saying, Gerald was discharged from the hospital today. Aren't you going to pick him up? Paula lowered her eyes. The tattoo on her ankle seemed to ache faintly again. She pressed her lips together. Susie is there. If I go, I'll just be unnecessary. Besides, Gerald and I are about to get divorced. Mrs. Ramos sighed. Paula, I've seen the feelings between you and Gerald over the years. If you're willing to stay by his side, I can guarantee that no one will be able to shake your position as the young madam of the Ramos family. But no one could guarantee that Gerald's heart didn't belong to Susie. Mrs. Ramos, the terms of our deal from the beginning were simple. I would give birth to a child for him and then leave with the money. That's all. In front of outsiders, Paula would call Mrs. Ramos mom. But in private, she always kept a clear distance and addressed her formally as Mrs. Ramos. It was her way of constantly reminding herself. Her relationship with Gerald had begun as a transaction. She shouldn't become too emotionally involved. Yet after 5 years of shared days and nights, she still couldn't stop herself from getting drawn in. She had even once thought about living a proper life with him. No one knew that when she agreed to Mrs. Ramos's deal back then, it wasn't entirely for the money. The truth was, she had met Gerald when she was very young. Many years ago, he had already taken a place in her heart. But reality proved one thing. What wasn't meant to belong to her would never belong to her. After ending the call with Mrs. Ramos, Paula put down her pen, stood up, and drove away from the villa. On the roadside, she found a tattoo shop. The shop owner looked at the tattoo on her ankle. This flower is beautifully done. Someone clearly put a lot of care into it. Are you sure you want to remove it? Paula replied calmly. Remove it? Well, the process will hurt a bit. Try to endure it. Paula sat in the chair, staring at the tattoo on her ankle. The tattoo had been done during the first year of her passionate newlywed days with Gerald. He had painstakingly learned the technique himself and personally tattooed it for her. Back then, he had asked what she wanted. She said she wanted a black mandala flower. Gerald had asked curiously, why this flower? Does it have some special meaning for you? She had smiled and replied, no special meaning. I just like it. What he didn't know was that the black mandala symbolized a wandering love, an emblem of despair and a clear-minded fall into darkness. just like her love for him. Now the dream had ended, and her love for him was fading, just like the mandala tattoo gradually disappearing from her skin. When Paula walked out of the tattoo shop and hadn't yet gotten into her car, she unexpectedly ran into Gerald stepping out of a Bentley Mulsanne. He looked surprised. "Paula? What are you doing here?" Chapter 4. As soon as he asked the question, Gerald seemed to realize something. His handsome face darkened. "Were you following me?" Paula was about to say she wasn't, but Susie, who had just stepped out of the car, spoke first. "I think it's just a coincidence. Paula probably wouldn't go as far as stalking us. It really is a coincidence. I'll be going now. Enjoy yourselves." Paula turned to leave, but Susie suddenly grabbed her arm. "Come to think of it, we haven't properly met yet. Since we ran into each other here, why don't you join us for a meal?" She turned to the tall man beside her. "Gerald, you don't mind if I invite Paula, do you?" Gerald's expression turned complicated for a few seconds, but in the end, he didn't refuse. Paula was brought into the restaurant. After ordering their food, Susie smiled at Paula. "Paula, you might not know this, but Gerald and I started dating back in college. Many of our friends used to envy our relationship. These past years, I had to stay overseas for certain reasons, but I've heard a little about you and Gerald. Paula, I'm very grateful to you for taking such good care of Gerald all these years." When Paula noticed Susie openly holding one of Gerald's hands, she immediately understood. Susie had invited her to this meal to declare her claim. Seeing that Gerald had no intention of pulling his hand away, Paula wasn't surprised. Yet her chest still ached as if ants were gnawing at her heart. She didn't respond. Instead, she made an excuse and got up to go to the restroom. When she came out, she saw Gerald standing by the wall. His eyes were dark and unreadable. "Paula, Susie and you don't need to explain. I understand." She was about to leave, but he suddenly grabbed her wrist. "I know this is unfair to you, but she has suffered a lot abroad all these years. If I didn't bring her back, she wouldn't survive out there." Bitterness filled Paula's chest. She looked up at him. "Do you think the Ramos family would tolerate her?" Of course Gerald knew. The Ramos family would never tolerate Susie. His thin lips pressed together. "You will always be the young madam of the Ramos family. I won't divorce you because of her, but my heart." But his heart would no longer belong solely to her. Paula thought about the past 5 years. He had rejected every ambiguous approach from other women because of her. In public and private, he always openly declared that she was the only one for him. He remembered her monthly cycle, her birthday every year, and every single wedding anniversary. Even things she herself had forgotten, he would remember carefully for her. Yet that deep and devoted love was no longer hers alone. She suddenly smiled. "Tomorrow is our wedding anniversary. Paula, spend the anniversary with me one more time, because there would never be another one. Let it be a final farewell to the love they once shared." Gerald was silent for a moment before saying, "All right." He let go of her hand. Paula walked out of the restroom first and returned to her seat in the restaurant. The fact that she and Gerald had left the table one after another had already made Susie unhappy. Susie stared at her coldly. "What did you say to Gerald?" Paula replied flatly, "None of your business." "Paula, do you still not understand? The person Gerald loves is me. I'm the one who should be the young madam of the Ramos family. You're just a thief who took advantage of his amnesia and stole the 5 years of love that belonged to me." Facing Susie's almost twisted anger, Paula let out a cold laugh. "A thief is still better than the daughter of someone who destroyed his family. Then I'll show you clearly whether he cares more about you, the thief, or me, the daughter of his family's enemy." Furious, Susie suddenly grabbed Paula's hands and forcefully shoved them into the tea stove used for boiling water. Paula didn't even have time to react. A violent, unbearable pain shot through her hands, so intense it tore through her entire body. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Gerald rushing over after hearing the commotion. Susie immediately released Paula and instead pushed her own hands into the stove. In the next instant, Susie's scream echoed through the restaurant. "Susie!" Gerald dashed over. When he saw Susie's burned hands, he picked her up and rushed out of the restaurant. "Gerald!" Paula tried to call out to him, but all she could see was his hurried retreating back. From beginning to end, he never once turned around to look at her, whose burns were clearly far worse. Cold sweat poured down Paula's body. The pain tore through every nerve in her body. Before long, she lost consciousness. Chapter 5. When Paula woke up, she was in a hospital filled with the smell of disinfectant. Her hands had been treated and wrapped in thick bandages, looking like dumplings. The intense pain was still there. She gasped sharply from the agony. Just then, Paula heard a conversation behind the curtain beside her, Gerald talking to a doctor. The doctor said, "Miss Susie's hand has a burn that's quite serious. It will probably be very difficult for it to recover to its original appearance." Susie immediately spoke with a trembling, tearful voice. "My hands are the most beautiful part of me. If they can't recover, won't they look ugly from now on?" Gerald comforted her softly. "It's all right. It's only a small area, but it'll still look terrible." "Gerald, please think of something. I don't want my hands to become ugly." He had no choice but to ask the doctor, "Is there a solution?" "The only option is a skin graft, but we need to find someone willing to donate the skin." Gerald suddenly remembered that Paula and Susie had similar skin tones. Without hesitation, he pulled aside the curtain and tilted his chin toward Paula. "Then use hers." Paula sat up abruptly, disbelief written all over her face. "What did you say?" "Susie's hands are the thing she treasures most. We only need a small piece of your skin." "She treasures her hands, so does that mean I don't treasure mine?" Gerald frowned, his handsome face dark with irritation. "Paula, it's just a small favor. I'll compensate you afterward." Paula felt as if she had just heard a joke. "Gerald, do you know that my hands are used to draw design drafts? I'm already injured like this. And have you even asked who caused it?" "Susie did it on purpose." Gerald's voice turned cold. "Susie wouldn't do something like that." Paula's eyes widened. "So you're saying I'm slandering her?" "That's not important right now. What matters is arranging the skin graft surgery for her immediately." "I refuse. Don't even think about taking anything from me." But Gerald had already made up his mind. Ignoring her resistance completely, he turned to the doctor. "I'm her husband. I consent on her behalf." Paula had never imagined he could be this heartless. Panic surged through her. She hurriedly slid off the hospital bed and tried to run, but the bodyguards outside the door immediately pinned her down. She struggled desperately. "Let me go!" The bodyguards held her firmly as the doctor walked over with a syringe of anesthetic and injected it into her body without hesitation. Fear overwhelmed Paula. "You can't do this. You can't." She was pregnant. "Gerald, make them stop. Otherwise I'll hate you. I'll hate you forever." The word hate made Gerald's heart tighten instantly. Perhaps because their past 5 years had only ever been filled with love. The idea that she could hate him was something he had never imagined. Meeting the crimson hatred in her eyes, Gerald's Adam's apple moved slightly. A fleeting hesitation flashed through his gaze. The anesthetic worked quickly. Before Paula lost consciousness, the last thing she saw were Susie's triumphant smile and Gerald turning his face away. No longer looking at her, her eyes grew wet and sore. Her heart sank into complete despair. Thinking about it carefully, Gerald already knew Susie was the daughter of the people responsible for his father's death. Yet he still angered Mrs. Ramos and willingly took the family punishment to atone for her. If he could protect Susie to that extent, then asking for a piece of Paula's skin for Susie, what was that worth in comparison? Only now did Paula taste regret. She regretted falling in love with him. She regretted agreeing to that deal with Mrs. Ramos. If she had known he could abandon all principles for the daughter of his father's enemy, she would never have allowed herself to have even the slightest connection with him. When Paula woke up again, both Gerald and Susie were gone. Only one of Gerald's bodyguards remained beside the bed. The bodyguard handed her an exquisitely packaged brocade box. "Young madam, you're awake. This is a gift from Mr. Ramos as compensation." Paula didn't even look at it. She simply raised her hand and knocked it to the floor. "Get out." Chapter 6. Seeing that Paula was emotionally out of control, the bodyguard didn't stay long. Before leaving, he relayed one last message. "Mr. Ramos asked me to tell you that he remembers the wedding anniversary. He'll make time to come back and spend it with you." But Paula couldn't listen to any of that right now. After the bodyguard left, she hurriedly lifted the blanket and got off the hospital bed, heading straight to the obstetrics department for an examination. Fortunately, the doctor reassured her, "You don't need to worry too much. Anesthesia doesn't have a major impact during early pregnancy, since you're not showing signs of miscarriage right now." It means the fetus is still developing normally. Just keep up with regular prenatal checkups so we can detect any abnormalities in time. I understand. Thank you, doctor. After leaving the obstetrics department, Paula let out a breath of relief. But when she looked at her hands, wrapped like dumplings, missing a piece of skin, an overwhelming bitterness filled her chest. On the day of their wedding anniversary, Gerald really did come back, even though it had been Paula who asked him to spend the day with her. Seeing him now didn't bring the joy she had once imagined. The house hadn't been decorated warmly and romantically like in previous years. Instead, everything felt cold and bare. Gerald thought about the icy hatred in her eyes at the hospital, and something seemed to clog his chest. Assuming she was still angry, he handed her the gift he had prepared, his tone soft. Didn't you say recently that you were looking for pigeon blood ruby? I happened to see one at an auction this time, so I bought it for you. Paula was a jewelry designer. She had been searching for a pigeon blood ruby for her next design. She glanced at the crimson gemstone. Without even asking, she knew who he had gone to the auction with, because she had already seen a photo on social media posted by one of Gerald's friends. The caption read, "Mr. Ramos spent a fortune just to make a beauty smile." The amount of money he burned at the auction for Susie was more than 10 times the value of this ruby. Paula looked at it and almost wanted to laugh. He had openly appeared in public with the daughter of the people responsible for his father's death. Was he really not worried about what would happen if this made entertainment headlines? But it had nothing to do with her anymore. After all, they were about to divorce. Gerald looked around the bedroom and suddenly felt that something was strange. Something seemed missing. He couldn't quite place it. "Isn't there something missing in our bedroom?" he asked. Paula replied calmly. "I sorted out some unnecessary things and had the maid throw them away." What about the jar of stars? The jar of paper stars he had used to propose to her had always been placed in the most noticeable spot on the bedside table. Now it was gone. Paula's lips parted slightly, but before she could answer, his phone suddenly rang. Gerald took it out and answered. "Susie?" Susie's trembling voice came from the other end. "Gerald, I'm at a bar and some thugs are bothering me. I'm really scared." "Why are you at a bar?" I met some old friends I haven't seen in years. They heard I was back in the country and invited me out." "All right. I understand." Gerald frowned. "Don't be afraid. I'll come over right now." Hearing this, Paula immediately understood. Susie had deliberately made this call because she didn't want Gerald spending the anniversary with her. And yet, Gerald Ramos still panicked. After hanging up, he hurried toward the door. Watching him leave in such urgency, his entire attention on Susie, Paula didn't stop him, because this anniversary no longer meant anything to her either. However, when he reached the door, Gerald suddenly remembered something and turned back. "This Saturday there's a Ramos Group banquet. You're my wife and also the chief jewelry designer of the Ramos Group. You should attend. I'll come pick you up." Chapter 7. Since their divorce had not yet been finalized, Paula had no choice but to attend the banquet with Gerald. But only after arriving did she realize that Gerald had actually brought Susie to the event as well. She couldn't help asking, "She isn't part of the Ramos Group. Why is she allowed to be here?" Gerald replied vaguely. Susie felt bored staying in the villa and wanted to come along to see the excitement. "I couldn't refuse her." Paula was about to say something when a commotion suddenly erupted in one corner of the banquet hall. "So you're the daughter of the people who caused Mr. Ramos's father's death? And you still have the nerve to appear at a Ramos Group internal banquet?" Faced with several Ramos Group employees surrounding her, Susie snorted defiantly. "Gerald invited me. If he hasn't said anything, what right do you have to criticize me?" A loud slap rang out as one of the women struck her across the face. "You think just because you used to date Mr. Ramos we're going to worship you? Mr. Ramos and Ms. Paula are the married couple. Are you planning to become the third party in their marriage? Your parents caused Mr. Ramos's father's death, and now you want to come back and take Mr. Ramos away too? Have some shame." "Exactly. Strip her and throw her out onto the street, teach her a lesson." Several women surrounding Susie began pulling at the white evening dress she was wearing. Gerald's furious voice suddenly cut through the chaos. "Stop! Who allowed you to do this?" Seeing him stride over, Susie's eyes instantly reddened. Tears streamed down her face. Gerald took off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. When he saw clearly that the people bullying Susie were all company employees who usually had close contact with Paula, a surge of anger flashed in his eyes. He turned coldly to Paula. "Did you order them to do this?" Paula froze. "I didn't." "Stop arguing. In the entire company, who else besides you would have such hostility toward her?" He accused her without even investigating. So in his eyes, she was this kind of person? Paula had wanted to explain, but when she saw the unfamiliar, dark look in his eyes, the first time he had ever looked at her that way, her throat tightened. Suddenly, she felt there was no point explaining. They would soon have nothing to do with each other anyway. Did it really matter how he saw her? Susie clutched his arms, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Gerald, no one here welcomes me. I don't want to stay here anymore." "All right, I'll take you back." In front of everyone, he lifted Susie into his arms. His face was cold and stern, his eyes focused only on the woman in his arms. As he left, he even bumped into Paula without noticing. The impact from his shoulder made Paula stagger in her high heels. She accidentally crashed into the champagne tower behind her and fell to the ground. In an instant, the several-meter-tall champagne tower collapsed. All of it crashed down on her. Ah! Paula barely had time to raise her arms to protect her face. The rest of her body was slashed by countless shards of glass. Blood mixed with champagne as she lay in a pool of it, her entire body covered in crimson. "Young madam!" "Ms. Paula!" Everyone who saw the scene fell into chaos. Through Paula's blurry vision, she saw Gerald turn back and glance at her. He paused for a few seconds. Then Susie said something to him. Gerald turned away and left. Her body was in unbearable pain, but her heart felt numb. She wasn't surprised at all that he had once again ignored her injuries. Soon after, Paula lost consciousness. When she woke up again, she was in the hospital. A nurse noticed her opening her eyes. "You're finally awake. The employee who brought you here had to leave. Do you want to call a family member or friend to come take care of you?" Paula weakly shook her head. "No need. You were seriously injured. It took us a long time to remove all the glass fragments embedded in your body. You won't be able to move easily right now. It would be best to have someone come care for you." Just as the nurse finished speaking, Gerald suddenly burst into the room, but he hadn't come to check on her injuries. Like a gust of wind, Gerald rushed to the bedside, grabbed Paula's wrist, and pulled her off the bed. "Come with me." "What are you doing? Let go of me." "Gerald, it hurts." The countless wounds on her body made her frown in pain, sharp breaths escaping her lips. Gerald's expression was dark and severe. "Susie has been taken away by my mother. Right now, you're the only one who can save her." Chapter 8. Ignoring Paula's injuries and the nurse's attempts to stop him, Gerald forcibly dragged her out of the hospital and shoved her into the car. Then he took out his phone and called Mrs. Ramos. "Paula is with me. Release Susie." On the other end, Mrs. Ramos was stunned. "You're threatening me with Paula?" Gerald's expression darkened. "Paula is the daughter-in-law you've always been most satisfied with. I'm sure you wouldn't want anything to happen to her. You're using your own wife to threaten me into releasing that woman?" Mrs. Ramos snapped. "Do you really think I'll agree?" She was certain he wouldn't truly hurt Paula, so she remained unmoved. With an imposing voice, she continued, "I already showed mercy by allowing that woman to stay in South City. Yet she doesn't know her place. Instead of keeping a low profile, she keeps causing trouble and even dared to show up at a Ramos Group internal banquet. If I keep tolerating her, next time she'll dare challenge me directly." Gerald's tone grew colder. "Then it seems I'll have to do something before you're willing to release her." "Gerald, I advise you not to continue." Before Mrs. Ramos could finish speaking, Gerald abruptly hung up. The chills surrounding him made Paula shiver. A terrible premonition rose in her chest. "What are you going to do to me?" "Sorry, Paula, I don't have a choice." Hearing the indifference in his voice, Paula didn't hesitate for even half a second. She twisted the car handle, trying to escape. Gerald immediately noticed her intention. He yanked her back, locked the doors, and slammed on the gas. "Stop the car, Gerald! Stop the car!" No matter how hoarsely she screamed, he ignored her. Eventually, Gerald drove her to a construction site. He took out a rope and tightly bound her. During the process, Paula struggled, fought, and tried several times to run. But it was useless. Bound tightly, her eyes reddened. You really planned to use me to threaten your mother? Gerald couldn't bear to see her crying, but when he thought about Susie's uncertain fate in Mrs. Ramos's hands, panic overrode the small trace of softness in his heart. His throat felt dry as he wiped away her tears with his thumb. Don't worry, I'm only scaring her to force her to release Susie. I won't really hurt you. Won't really hurt her? Hadn't he hurt her enough already? A chill spread through Paula's heart as tears filled her eyes. Gerald, what did I ever do wrong for you to treat me like this? He didn't answer. He didn't even dare look at the wounded despair in her dim eyes. Instead, he turned his head aside and gave an order to his bodyguards. Following his instructions, they hoisted Paula up with an excavator. A rope suspended her in midair. Below her was a deep lake with no visible bottom. Terrified, she closed her eyes as tears streamed down uncontrollably. Standing on the ground, Gerald called Mrs. Ramos again, this time through a video call. He aimed the camera at Paula hanging in the air. Now, will you release Susie? Seeing the scene on the screen, Mrs. Ramos was stunned. Paula is your wife. Gerald wasted no words. Release Susie, and I'll lower Paula down. If you refuse, Paula falls into the lake. Choose. Mrs. Ramos's eyes widened in shock. Gerald began counting down. 10. Mrs. Ramos sucked in a sharp breath. 9. Paula smiled. 8. Her smile was full of despair. 7. Only when Gerald counted down to 1 did Mrs. Ramos finally give in. Enough. I'll release Susie. Don't hurt Paula. She's pregnant with. Gerald interrupted impatiently before she could finish. Tell me where she is. Once I see her in person, I'll release Paula. With no other choice, Mrs. Ramos revealed Susie's location. Gerald immediately ended the call and drove off. Paula didn't know how long she remained hanging in midair. Pain and cold spread through her entire body, and the world before her eyes seemed dull and gray. When Mrs. Ramos finally rushed to the scene and ordered someone to lower her down, Paula looked like a puppet that had lost its soul. Mrs. Ramos called out softly with guilt. Paula. I'm sorry. I didn't expect things to turn out like this. Don't worry, I will seek justice for you. But compared to justice, Paula cared about something else. She suddenly raised her head and asked the elegant woman in front of her. Mrs. Ramos, have my visa and divorce certificate been prepared? Chapter 9. Mrs. Ramos was stunned when Paula said that. You want to leave now? Yes. She wanted to leave. She wanted to get away from Gerald, from Susie, from the entire Ramos family. Otherwise, one day she might die without even knowing how it happened. After everything she had suffered during this period, the only thought in Paula's mind was a desperate urge to stay as far away as possible from everyone in the Ramos family. Mrs. Ramos's expression turned complicated. Let me make a call first. She took out her phone and dialed a number. After asking a few questions, she told Paula. Everything is ready. Paula nodded. Please have someone send them to the airport, and prepare a clean set of clothes for me. I'll head there now. Her wounds had reopened during all the turmoil, and fresh blood was seeping through them again. Mrs. Ramos said worriedly. Why don't you go back to the hospital first and recover from your injuries before? No, I want to leave now. Not even for a second did she want to stay. Not even for a moment did she want to see Gerald again. Seeing her determination, Mrs. Ramos could no longer persuade her and simply nodded. She bought Paula a plane ticket and personally drove her to the airport. After Paula changed into clean clothes and went through security, Mrs. Ramos said, I've already arranged everything over there. Once you arrive, someone will come pick you up. They had agreed on this from the very beginning. After Paula went abroad while pregnant, she would stay at a place arranged by Mrs. Ramos, where people would take care of her until she gave birth. Mrs. Ramos reminded her firmly. This child is extremely important to the Ramos family. So Paula, don't try anything clever. Paula gently placed a hand on her stomach. She knew very well that Mrs. Ramos had given in to Gerald's threat this time not because she cared about Paula. What she cared about was the child in Paula's womb. But now, her passport and visa were back in her hands. As long as she could leave the country, she would never allow anyone to control her again. Paula smiled and agreed with Mrs. Ramos's words on the surface. Then, without bringing anything with her, she boarded a plane bound for a foreign land. Falling in love with Gerald was the greatest regret of her life. Making that deal with Mrs. Ramos in order to get close to him and understand him had been the most foolish decision she had ever made. From this moment on, her life would never again have anything to do with the Ramos family. Gerald, this farewell will be our last. We will never meet again. Gerald found Susie in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The warehouse was filled with Mrs. Ramos's bodyguards. When they saw Gerald approaching with a cold, imposing aura, they all respectfully greeted him. Mr. Ramos. Gerald shot them a sharp glance. Get out. They had already received Mrs. Ramos's order to release Susie. Now that Gerald had arrived, there was no need for them to stay. The bodyguards quickly dispersed and left. Gerald turned and saw Susie tied tightly to a chair. Her hair was messy, and the swollen marks on her face were painfully obvious. She looked utterly miserable. A sharp pain struck his heart as he hurried toward her. Gerald tore off the tape covering her mouth and quickly untied the ropes. The moment she regained her freedom, Susie threw herself into his arms. Gerald. Tears had already soaked her face, and her voice was hoarse. It was obvious that before he arrived, she had suffered quite a lot. Gerald held her tightly and gently patted her back. It's okay, I'm here now. Susie was clearly frightened by Mrs. Ramos's actions this time. Her body trembled uncontrollably as she cried in his arms. After her emotions calmed down slightly, Gerald took her to the hospital. The doctor treated the swelling on her face and then turned to Gerald. Miss Susie's face is a little swollen, but there are no other external injuries. Take some medicine back and apply it daily. It should go down quickly. Gerald nodded slightly to show he understood. Chapter 10. Before taking Susie away from the hospital, Gerald suddenly remembered Paula, who had originally been hospitalized for her injuries. He said to Susie, "Wait here for a moment. I'll be back soon." Susie grabbed his arm uneasily. "Where are you going?" Gerald spoke gently. "I'm going to see someone. They're also in this hospital. It won't take long. Just wait here." During the 5 years when he had lost his memory, he and Paula had truly been in love. Even though he had now regained his memory and Susie once again occupied his heart, that didn't mean Paula had no place in it. Paula had actually been very good to him. The 5 years he spent married to her had been the most peaceful, comfortable, and happy period of his life. Gerald thought, if he had never regained his memory, perhaps they would have continued living happily like that forever. But now that his memory had returned, he couldn't abandon Susie. Still, Paula would always remain Mrs. Ramos. Gerald settled Susie in the hospital's medical room before heading to the inpatient ward to find Paula's room. When he pushed open the door, the room was empty. Everything inside remained exactly as it had been when he had dragged her away earlier. Gerald paused slightly. Logically speaking, by now his mother should have already picked Paula up and sent her back to the hospital. Just as Gerald was about to call Mrs. Ramos to ask where she had taken Paula, Susie suddenly appeared at the door of the room. "Gerald, who are you looking for here?" Seeing her, Gerald frowned slightly. He put down his phone and walked over to support her. "Didn't I tell you to wait in the medical room? Why did you follow me here?" Susie bit her lip. "I was scared staying alone." Gerald looked at her for a moment. In the end, he temporarily gave up calling Mrs. Ramos. "I'll take you back first," he said gently. He brought Susie back to the villa under his name. After calling the servants he had arranged there to take care of her and instructing them carefully, he turned to leave. But after only a few steps, Susie suddenly wrapped her arms around his waist from behind. Her voice trembled softly. "Gerald, don't go." Gerald lowered his eyes to the hands tightly around him. "It's getting late. I still have some things to handle. Eat something and go to bed early." Susie shook her head, resting her face against his back. "If you leave, Mrs. Ramos might come here again with people the next moment. I'm afraid to stay here alone." This was already the second time Mrs. Ramos had kidnapped her. Everyone knew how much Mrs. Ramos despised her. Gerald removed her hands and turned back to face her. "Don't worry, I'll have people guarding this place. Nothing will happen to you again." "No." Susie refused immediately. "The entire Ramos family listens to Mrs. Ramos. If you're not here, who would dare disobey her?" The only person who could truly stand against Mrs. Ramos was Gerald. No matter what, Susie didn't want him to leave. Her eyes were red, and her expression and voice were filled with obvious fragility. "I don't want to stay here alone. Can you stay with me?" Her almost pleading tone finally softened Gerald's heart. Thinking about how she had just gone through the kidnapping, it was understandable that she was still frightened and needed him there to feel safe. He gently wiped away the tears at the corners of her eyes. "All right, I won't leave. Don't cry anymore." Only then did Susie smile in relief. Gerald stayed with her at the villa for 3 days. Even his work documents were delivered there by his assistant so he could handle them. 3 days later, however, he had to attend an important company meeting. Susie showed a hint of dissatisfaction. "Can't this meeting be postponed? Or held through a video call? This meeting is about a major project for the Ramos group. I must be there in person. Besides, I can't stay here forever without going anywhere." As the president of the Ramos group, he had countless responsibilities. He couldn't revolve around her 24 hours a day. But what if Mrs. Ramos comes again with people? "I'll have my bodyguards guard the villa. If my mother comes, they'll notify me immediately." Seeing that he had arranged everything carefully, Susie had no choice but to agree. After attending the meeting at the company, Gerald suddenly thought about Paula again. Using her to threaten his mother had left him feeling guilty. Over the past few days, he had tried calling her several times to apologize, but her phone had been switched off the entire time. So after leaving the company, Gerald told his driver to take him back to the house he shared with Paula. However, the housemaid told him, "Young madam hasn't come home for several days." Chapter 11. Gerald was stunned. "She hasn't come back these past few days?" "Yes." "Then why didn't you call and tell me?" The housemaid was frightened by the coldness in his voice and stammered nervously. "You also didn't come home these past few days." "I thought young madam was with you." Gerald frowned deeply and turned to leave immediately. Paula wasn't at the hospital, and she wasn't at home either. The only possibility Gerald could think of was that Mrs. Ramos had taken her to the Ramos family's old mansion. But when he arrived at the mansion and searched the entire estate, he still couldn't find Paula. Finally, Gerald found Mrs. Ramos sitting by the fish pond in the courtyard, calmly drinking tea. "Mom, where is Paula?" Mrs. Ramos looked up at him. "So now you remember her?" Gerald's expression darkened slightly. "Paula is my wife." "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Ramos gave a cold snort and set down her teacup. "She left." "Left?" "She went abroad." Gerald's pupils suddenly shrank. Why did she go abroad? In order to ensure Paula could safely give birth to the child. Mrs. Ramos had no intention of telling him the truth. Instead, she handed him a document folder from the tea table. "You care so much about that woman, Susie. Then take a good look at what she's been doing all these years abroad, and see if she's worth you protecting her without any limits." Gerald frowned in confusion and opened the folder. One photograph after another appeared before his eyes. Photos of Susie intimately involved with different men. Some showed her linking arms with them, others showed them hugging. There were even photos of kissing, and pictures taken inside hotel rooms. There were also medical records documenting several abortions she had undergone abroad. Gerald's pupils contracted sharply. It felt as if someone had slapped him hard across the face. His face burned. Mrs. Ramos sneered coldly. "You didn't care that her parents caused your father's death. For her. You got into a car accident and lost your memory. For her. You've repeatedly defied me. For her. You even ignored the safety of your own wife, Paula. But what about Susie? What has she done for you? While you were suffering from amnesia all these years, she was abroad living a reckless life with countless men. If she had simply dated single men, that would be one thing, but she interfered in other people's marriages and became the other woman more than once. I truly don't understand how long you plan to remain blinded by her. Gerald, wake up! She isn't worth you turning your back on everyone. The only reason she came back with you is because she made too many enemies abroad. The wives of those men hate her, and she couldn't stay there anymore. That's why she did everything she could to get you to bring her back." Mrs. Ramos's voice was cold and authoritative, each word striking directly at his heart. "If you keep being obsessed with that woman Susie, then from now on I'll pretend I never had a son like you, and you'll never need to come back here again." Gerald stood stiffly, his breath uneven. After leaving the Ramos mansion, he returned to the villa where Susie was staying. He found her and threw the stack of photos and documents onto the table in front of her. Gerald's entire presence radiated cold fury. "Explain." When Susie saw the photos scattered across the coffee table, her heart trembled. Her expression changed drastically, and her face turned pale. No, that's not what it looks like. Oh, Gerald said with a cold, almost mocking smile. Then what is it? A terrifying aura surrounded him. Susie hurriedly said, "These photos are fake. They're all edited." Fake? Yes, they're fake. Mrs. Ramos can't stand me, so she fabricated all of this to frame me and break us apart. Gerald, if you believe these photos, then her plan will succeed. Chapter 12. Mrs. Ramos hated Susie's parents for causing her husband's death and taking away the man she loved. Naturally, she also hated Susie and could never tolerate her being entangled with Gerald, if it meant breaking them apart so that Gerald would stop caring about Susie. There was nothing Mrs. Ramos wouldn't do. Fabricating stories and tarnishing Susie's past was not impossible, but Gerald was not a fool. He didn't simply believe Susie's one-sided explanation. He immediately ordered his assistant to investigate everything Susie had done abroad over the past few years. At the same time, he had professionals examine the photos to determine whether they were digitally manipulated. Susie knew very well that nothing could stay hidden. Once Gerald finished investigating, her entire life would collapse. So during the few days Gerald's assistant was conducting the investigation, she hurriedly booked a plane ticket. Late at night, when the bodyguards outside the villa had relaxed their vigilance, she seized the opportunity to sneak away and head for the airport. However, when her car arrived at the airport, just as she stepped out and before she could even enter the terminal, she saw Gerald leaning against a car door, already waiting there. Gerald stared at her coldly. "It's late. Where are you going?" Susie's face instantly turned pale, and her heart sank. "So you're feeling guilty and planning to leave South City before I return?" Before she could even offer an explanation, Gerald personally had his bodyguards seize her and drag her away from the airport. They brought her back to the villa. As soon as they entered, a bodyguard shoved her heavily. She staggered several steps before collapsing onto the floor. Gerald threw the investigation reports and the authentication results of the photos in front of her, his anger blazing. "Now tell me, what else do you have to deny?" Panic filled Susie's face, and tears flowed immediately. "That's not it. Things aren't what they look like. None of this is real. The evidence is right in front of you. And you still refuse to admit it?" At this point, all her denials sounded futile to him. Susie knew denying it was useless. She crawled toward him in desperation and grabbed his legs, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. "I did those things, but I had no choice." Gerald looked down at her coldly. "No choice? When Mrs. Ramos drove me out of the country back then, I had nothing, no money, nothing at all. I could barely survive. I had no choice but to date those men." Gerald gave a cold laugh. "If you want to say it nicely, you dated them. If you want to say it honestly, you were being kept by them." Susie's face stiffened. "Fine. The first time you interfered in someone else's marriage, you say it was because you had no choice to survive abroad. But the second time? The third time?" Susie froze, suddenly unable to say a word. Disgust appeared in Gerald's eyes. "So all those times you willingly became someone's mistress, including those abortions you had, were also because you had no choice to survive?" Susie spoke weakly. "What else could I do? I was a woman alone in a foreign country with no one to rely on. If I didn't depend on those men who liked me, who else could I rely on? You had your own hands and feet. You could have done anything. Why did you have to become someone who destroys other people's marriages?" Susie's voice began to choke with sobs. "I know what I did wasn't right, but that's all in the past. The only person I've ever loved has always been you." "Gerald loved me?" Gerald sneered. "Don't disgust me." "Disgust?" He said she disgusted him? Susie stared at him in shock. Gerald's voice was icy. "You keep saying you love me, but after leaving me you went from one married man to another. That's your love?" You had such a terrible reputation abroad that the wives of those men joined forces to suppress you and wanted you gone. You knew you couldn't stay there anymore, so you deliberately tried to remind me of you, remind me of our past, just so I would bring you back to this country. Isn't that the truth?" He tore apart her false mask without mercy. The deep disgust in his expression pierced her eyes. Susie's face suddenly changed. "And what right do you have to criticize me?" She snapped. "After we separated, weren't you with Paula as well?" Chapter 13. Gerald's voice turned cold. "You have no right to mention Paula. You're not worthy of it." "Not worthy?" Susie let out a bitter laugh. "And you are?" She slowly released his legs and pushed herself up from the ground, under his icy gaze. She smiled mockingly. You say I disgust you, but didn't you disgust Paula as well? Didn't you betray your marriage to her? Gerald suddenly grabbed her by the throat. Shut up. But Susie refused to be silent. Instead, she spoke recklessly. We're the same. Neither of us is more noble than the other. Gerald's anger surged, his expression dark as if he wanted to strangle her. Susie's face twisted with resentment. And what right do you have to judge what I did abroad all those years? The reason I was sent overseas and ended up like that was because of your family. Gerald looked at her in disbelief. Because of us? Back then, her parents had caused his father's death. The Ramos family had wanted to wipe them out completely. It was Gerald who had defied everything, who had even risked being labeled unfilial, just to protect her. And now she was accusing his family of ruining her life? At that moment, Mrs. Ramos walked in. I told you long ago, she said coldly. Her parents were despicable people. Of course they couldn't raise a decent daughter. The entire family is ungrateful and heartless. Now you can finally see her true face. The moment Susie saw her, she froze like a mouse facing a cat. Her face turned pale and her body trembled violently. Mrs. Ramos. Mrs. Ramos sneered at Gerald. You protected her so fiercely, yet this woman has never been loyal to you. Instead, she blames you. Now tell me, are you still unwilling to let go of the little romance you once had with her? Gerald was utterly disappointed. The exhaustion and disillusionment on his face were unmistakable. Everything he had done for Susie now felt like a joke. He closed his eyes briefly and took a deep breath before making his decision. From now on, I won't involve myself in her matters anymore. Do whatever you want with her. In other words, he was handing her over to Mrs. Ramos. Susie knew very well what kind of person Mrs. Ramos was. Back then, it was Mrs. Ramos who had sent her parents to prison and bribed people inside to torture them to death. If she fell into Mrs. Ramos's hands again, her fate would be far worse. Terrified, Susie rushed forward and grabbed Gerald's hand as he turned to leave. Gerald, you can't abandon me. You can't treat me like this. Before she could finish, Gerald pulled his hand away as if he had touched something filthy. His voice was completely cold. Take care of yourself. Then he walked out of the villa without a single glance back. Susie stood there frozen, her face drained of color. Mrs. Ramos immediately signaled the bodyguards beside her. They moved forward and restrained Susie. Gerald didn't leave after stepping outside. Instead, he leaned against the wall. Inside the villa, Susie's screams and curses echoed through the air. Yet his heart was as cold as iron. He no longer reacted. After nearly an hour of torment, Mrs. Ramos looked at the miserable woman lying on the ground and finally felt satisfied. Throw her into a mental institution. She ordered the bodyguards. Let her enjoy herself there. The bodyguards dragged Susie outside. Mrs. Ramos followed them out. Gerald, who had been waiting outside the entire time, suddenly asked, "Where is Paula?" "Her?" Mrs. Ramos replied. "You sent her abroad. Where did you send her?" Mrs. Ramos studied him carefully and immediately understood his intention. "You want to find Paula?" "Yes," Gerald said quietly. "I want to bring her back." Back then, Mrs. Ramos had made the deal with Paula because she feared Gerald would be blinded by Susie and the Ramos family line would end. But now Gerald had awakened, and Susie had been dealt with. She no longer had to worry about Gerald refusing to let Paula keep the child. As long as the woman Gerald loved was no longer Susie, Mrs. Ramos didn't care who it was. Any woman would do. So she told Gerald the truth, that Paula was pregnant and had been sent abroad to quietly carry the baby to term. However, before she could finish speaking, her phone suddenly rang. It was a call from overseas. Mrs. Ramos answered. A voice came from the other end. "Mrs. Ramos, I'm very sorry to inform you that Paula, she's dead." Chapter 14. What? Hearing the news, Mrs. Ramos's body went weak. Gerald's expression changed drastically. He snatched the phone and demanded, "Who did you say died?" "The woman who was sent here not long ago to rest during her pregnancy, Paula." A sharp pain stabbed through Gerald's chest. From the other end of the phone, the person continued, "Today, while I was out buying groceries, the house Paula was staying in had a gas leak and exploded. Unfortunately, she didn't escape. She died inside." The place Mrs. Ramos had arranged for Paula to stay during her pregnancy was a remote town on the edge of Europe. The environment there was beautiful, the air was fresh, and both the security and medical care were excellent. Most of the residents were retirees or pregnant women who had come there to rest and give birth. When Gerald arrived in the town, what he saw was the villa reduced to ruins. Everything was debris. Everything inside the house had been blown to dust. It was impossible for anyone to survive such an explosion, there wouldn't even be bones left. Yet Gerald still couldn't believe it. He suddenly turned to the Filipino maid standing beside him. "How can you be certain she died in the explosion?" The maid had been hired by Mrs. Ramos to take care of Paula. The medical staff there had also been arranged by Mrs. Ramos to ensure Paula could safely give birth. The maid explained honestly. "When I went out to buy groceries, she was still in her room taking a nap. I had only been gone for less than 5 minutes when the gas exploded. I asked the neighbors nearby, and no one saw her come out." Gerald felt his heart shake violently. His dark eyes turned red instantly, and pain spread through his entire body. His chest hurt so badly that he could barely breathe. How was this possible? How could she suddenly be dead? He had only just learned that she was pregnant with his child. He had only just planned to bring her back. Yet now he received the news of her death. He hadn't even had the chance to apologize. He hadn't had the chance to ask for her forgiveness. He hadn't had the chance to tell her how deeply he regretted everything. Ever since he regained his memory, he had been completely consumed by Susie. He had ignored Paula. He had hurt her. He had forgotten the 5 years they spent together. He deserved to die. But now, it was too late to make amends. She was gone, and so was their child. Both had died in that explosion. The more Gerald thought about it, the more unbearable the pain became. The more he thought about it, the more he wanted to kill himself. He slapped himself over and over again until his face swelled. Regret and hatred grew wildly in his heart. When Gerald finally returned from Europe to South City, the first place he went was the mental institution where Susie had been locked up. Susie had already been there for some time. The environment and the chaotic patients had nearly driven her insane. If she stayed any longer, she would soon become just like them. Until Gerald's bodyguards dragged her out and brought her before him. When Susie saw Gerald for the first time in nearly half a month, the last bit of sanity she had clung to suddenly ignited with hope. She hurriedly crawled toward him and grabbed at his legs, joy filling her eyes. "You came to take me away, didn't you? You came to save me, right?" Gerald looked down at the woman kneeling beside him. "Save you? Gerald, I know I was wrong. Everything I did before was wrong. Please take me away. I don't want to stay here anymore. The people here are too terrifying." She cried in fear. "The ones who wronged the Ramos family were my parents. Not me. They're already dead. I've never hurt you. Please, let me go." But as Gerald looked at her, all he could think about was Paula. Paula, who had died in the explosion. He remembered her burned hands. He remembered the skin taken from her. He remembered her lying in a pool of blood among shattered champagne glasses. He remembered her hanging helplessly in midair. Every memory was like a knife slicing into his heart. He hated his own blindness. He had mistaken a worthless stone for a priceless pearl. For a woman like Susie, he had hurt Paula again and again. Gerald's voice turned icy. "If it weren't for you, Paula would never have left South City. She wouldn't have died, and I wouldn't have lost her, or the child she was carrying." Chapter 15. Susie was confused. "What?" "Paula is gone," Gerald said coldly, "and so is the child she was carrying for me. Do you really think I'll let you go after that?" Thinking back now, Gerald suddenly realized that Paula's burned hands earlier had been Susie's doing, but he had been too foolish at the time. He hadn't believed Paula when she accused Susie. The more he thought about it, the more uncontrollable his anger became. His face darkened. "Like mother, like daughter, just as vicious as your parents. Letting you go would be far too easy." He added up all the old grudges and new hatred together. Immediately, he ordered the bodyguards to take her away. What followed was the most horrifying day of Susie's life. Gerald's bodyguards tied her to a roller coaster and forced her to ride it for 3 hours. Then they strapped her onto a drop tower ride for 2 full hours. After that, they took her bungee jumping again and again, so many times she lost count. She vomited repeatedly. She even fainted several times. Each time she passed out, the bodyguard splashed cold water on her to wake her up. When it was finally over, She was sent back to the mental institution. There, she still had to face the mad patients, who sometimes bit, attacked, and beat people without warning. But it didn't end there. This kind of torment repeated itself every single day afterward. Her body and mind were completely broken. She was tortured until she was barely human anymore. And with every passing day, her hatred for Gerald grew stronger. No one knew how many days had passed like this. One evening, Gerald had just finished entertaining clients and walked out of a restaurant. Suddenly, Susie appeared beside his car without warning. "You have no right to treat me like that," she screamed. "You're the one who deserves to die. Everyone in the Ramos family deserves to die. Go to hell." Driven insane, she rushed at him with a kitchen knife. Gerald was caught off guard. She slashed him twice before the bodyguards reacted. They quickly seized the knife and pinned her to the ground. Blood poured from the 2 wounds on Gerald's shoulder. Cold sweat ran down his face. Not long after, he collapsed from the injuries. He was immediately rushed to the hospital. When Mrs. Ramos received the news, she hurried there. Seeing Gerald still inside the emergency room, her anger erupted. She glared at the bodyguards. How did that crazy woman escape from the mental institution? The bodyguards lowered their heads nervously. They said, "She snuck out." Mrs. Ramos was furious. She regretted not dealing with Susie more ruthlessly before. Now Susie had escaped and injured Gerald. Her voice was cold with anger. "Send her to the police station. Lock her in prison." "Yes, ma'am, we'll take care of it immediately." Gerald was eventually saved. His wounds required countless stitches. When he was finally out of danger and transferred to a hospital room, Mrs. Ramos's heart finally settled. Looking at Gerald, who had regained consciousness, she said with relief, "Your father is already gone. Paula and the child she was carrying are gone too. If something happened to you as well, how could I continue living in this world alone?" Paula. Every time her name was mentioned, Gerald felt as though his heart were being torn apart. The woman he had loved for 6 years. The woman who had shared his life day and night. He would never see her again. Even now, he still couldn't forgive himself. Gerald gave a bitter smile. "Maybe this is the punishment I deserve for not cherishing her." Mrs. Ramos knew how deeply Paula's death had affected him. That pain had never left his heart. She sighed. "The dead can't come back to life. It's been so long already. Try to let it go." Paula and the child she carried were indeed tragic losses. But what had happened could never be changed. Mrs. Ramos tried to comfort him. "There are many good women in the world. Paula is gone. But you can still meet someone else. Let go of the past." But Gerald couldn't let go. Every time he remembered the 5 years he spent with Paula, it felt as though his heart were being ripped open again and again. His throat felt dry and hoarse. "Mom, do you think Paula might not actually be dead?" Mrs. Ramos shook her head. "How could that be? In that situation, there's no way she could have survived. Unless the explosion was something she planned herself." Gerald fell silent. Deep down, a thought began to form. Maybe Paula had really arranged the explosion herself. Maybe she had done it to escape from him. After all, he had shattered her heart completely. Chapter 16. The explosion caused by the gas leak had indeed been designed by Paula as a way to fake her death and escape. She did it to completely cut ties with the Ramos family. Back then, after she made the deal with Mrs. Ramos, her passport had been kept by Mrs. Ramos. But now that her passport, visa, and divorce certificate were all finally in her hands, she no longer wanted anything to do with the Ramos family. Gerald's actions had completely broken her heart. If she gave birth to this child and the Ramos family took the child back, she couldn't imagine what kind of life the child would grow up in, or what the child might become in such a family. Although giving birth to the child had been part of her agreement with Mrs. Ramos, breaking that promise now did feel like going back on her word. But when she thought about Gerald's madness for Susie, she couldn't help feeling that letting this child grow up in the Ramos family would be a tragedy. So she arranged the explosion. While the people Mrs. Ramos had assigned to watch over her were away, Paula released gas into the house and set a timed detonation. Then she quietly left the remote town in a car she had already prepared. After that, she contacted a close friend of hers who lived in Europe. She asked her friend to help her change her name, replace all her contact information, abandon everything tied to her past, and find a way for her to obtain a visa to leave Europe. Eventually, after traveling through several places, She arrived in Italy. Not long after settling there, one day her friend Lisa suddenly rushed into the small apartment Paula was renting. As soon as she entered, Lisa asked anxiously, "Did you see the news from back home?" Paula looked confused. "What news?" "Your ex-husband was stabbed by a crazy woman. He was seriously injured and hospitalized." Paula froze for a moment when she heard that. Lisa pulled out her phone, opened a news website from their home country, searched quickly, and showed her the page. "Look! It's all over the news." The page was filled with reports about Gerald being hospitalized with severe injuries. And the woman who stabbed him was Susie. Paula was surprised, but at the same time, not entirely surprised. She had long suspected that with the deep hatred between Susie and the Ramos family, something terrible would eventually happen. She just hadn't expected it to turn into this kind of violent confrontation. Lisa put away her phone and sat down on the sofa, clicking her tongue. "These people are completely insane. Good thing you got away from the Ramos family in time. If you were still involved with them, who knows what would have happened to you." At that moment, Paula also felt that leaving had been the right decision. Still, a trace of worry crossed her mind. "I just don't know if my fake death really fooled the Ramos family." "It probably did," Lisa said. "If it hadn't, with the way the Ramos family operates, they would have already searched the entire world for you." Paula thought to herself. Hopefully that was true. She didn't want her life to be disrupted by the Ramos family ever again. Lisa suddenly asked curiously, "By the way, what exactly did you like about Gerald back then?" She and Lisa had grown up together as childhood best friends. After graduating from university, Lisa immigrated to Italy with her family, while Paula stayed in their home country and married Gerald, becoming the young madam of the Ramos family. They had never lost contact over the years. This time, when Paula changed her identity, it was Lisa who helped her. So Lisa knew most of the story between Paula and Gerald. Paula pressed her lips together and smiled faintly. "I was young back then, still in middle school. We were in the same class. The first time I got my period, I didn't know what was happening. The whole class laughed at me." She paused before continuing softly. "He was the only one who didn't laugh. He took off his school jacket and let me wear it so I wouldn't have to keep standing there in embarrassment." It had been such a small gesture, but to her, it made him feel like the most special person in the world. And because of that moment, he had lived in her heart for many years. Lisa looked puzzled. "Did Gerald ever know about that?" Paula shook her head. "It happened so long ago, he probably forgot it completely." Not only did Gerald not remember it, he never even knew that she had secretly loved him for so many years. At first, when Mrs. Ramos approached her with the deal, Paula had thought it was fate giving her a chance. She had even believed that if they eventually divorced, it would at least happen peacefully. But in the end, their story ended like this. Lisa hesitated before asking another question. "Do you still love him?" Paula answered without hesitation. "No." The moment she saw how he repeatedly lost all sense of boundaries for Susie, her love had already died. "And the baby?" Lisa asked. "Are you going to keep it, or abort it?" Paula frowned slightly and placed a hand on her stomach. This child. Chapter 17. Paula still hadn't decided whether she should terminate the child in her womb. Lisa noticed her hesitation and patted her on the shoulder. "It's okay if you haven't figured it out yet. Take your time. This is your child. As far as the Ramos family is concerned, you're already gone. Even if you give birth to the baby, they won't know." Paula's parents had died when she was young. After that, she had relied on her grandmother for companionship, but only 2 years after she married Gerald. Her grandmother also passed away. Now, although she was alone and free, there was still a touch of loneliness in her life. Lisa strongly supported her decision to keep the child. After all, she had already divorced Gerald, and the Ramos family believed she was dead. Even if the child were born, the Ramos family wouldn't be able to find her. Paula now had money, and she could have a child of her own. Just thinking about it was enough to make people envious. Lisa winked at Paula. "If you stop liking a man, you can just replace him. Anyway, there aren't many reliable ones out there. Dating is fine, but finding someone who can truly stay with you for a lifetime is rare. A woman can live her life without a husband. Men aren't a necessity, but having a child of your own makes life feel more complete and meaningful. Besides, whatever else you might say about Gerald, His looks and his genes are pretty good. If you give birth to the baby, just think of it as borrowing his genetics. Lisa had lived abroad for a long time. Her thinking was quite open-minded and different from many people's. Paula smiled faintly. Then I'll think about it a little more. Think it through carefully. Don't make any hasty decisions, no matter whether you decide to terminate it or keep it. I'll support you. Okay. They didn't continue discussing the child. Lisa suddenly remembered something else. Oh right. You asked me earlier to help you find a suitable shop space to open your studio. I found one. Want to go take a look now? Paula's eyes immediately lit up, and she nodded without hesitation. Paula had studied jewelry design. Her lifelong dream had always been to build a jewelry brand of her own and make it known to the world. But back in South City, she had been the chief designer under the Ramos Corporation. After making that deal with Mrs. Ramos, it became even more impossible for her to break away from the Ramos Corporation and build a brand of her own. Now that she had completely cut ties with the Ramos family, she could finally pursue her dream freely. Paula was very satisfied with the shop Lisa found for her and immediately decided to rent it. Mrs. Ramos had previously given her $1 billion, and she had quietly transferred the money away long ago. Paula felt no psychological burden about taking that money. After all, during the period when Gerald had lost his memory and become so irritable that no one dared approach him, she had been the one who cared for him tirelessly, devoting all her energy and effort. That $1 billion was something she deserved. And with that money, opening her own jewelry studio was no problem at all. Time passed in the blink of an eye, and soon 3 years had gone by. By then, Paula's studio had grown stronger day by day. From an obscure little studio, it had developed through relentless effort into a well-known jewelry brand company. The jewelry she designed was deeply loved by wealthy ladies in high society. Even the brand's spokesperson was a hugely popular celebrity of the moment. While her company's brand became widely famous, she herself remained extremely low profile, because she didn't want the Ramos family to discover that she was still alive. She never appeared in public, and the company wasn't even registered under her name. However, even though she was cautious enough, she still unexpectedly ran into Gerald in the end. The day she met Gerald again was at a jewelry exhibition. This exhibition gathered the finest works of all the most famous designers of the time. Anyone in the industry wanted to come and admire it. One of the most famous jewelry necklaces from Paula's company had also been invited to be displayed. When Gerald saw that familiar face at the exhibition, he was momentarily dazed, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. Paula. Chapter 18. Paula was also shocked and surprised to run into him unexpectedly at this exhibition. He was dressed in an expensive handmade suit, his posture tall and straight, compared to 3 years ago. His face looked a little more mature. At this moment, his expression was filled with shock and an unbelievable surge of joy. She didn't know why he had appeared at an exhibition in Italy, but the Ramos Corporation was also involved in branded jewelry. Paula quickly regained her composure and said with a faint smile, "I'm sorry, sir. You've mistaken me for someone else." But Gerald stared at her beautiful and delicate face and simply refused to believe her. He fixed his gaze on her stubbornly. "You are Paula. Your face, your voice, they're exactly the same. You can't fool me." They had once loved each other and lived together for 5 years. He was familiar with everything about her, although she now looked radiant and elegant. And compared to when she left South City 3 years ago, her temperament had become more refined and energetic. He was absolutely certain she was Paula. Gerald couldn't hide his joy at all. His expression revealed overwhelming excitement. "I knew it. You didn't die in that explosion 3 years ago. You must still be alive." Paula frowned, thinking how unlucky she really was. 3 years had passed, yet she never expected to run into the person she least wanted to see here. Not wanting any connection or involvement with him, Paula coldly threw out a sentence. "I said, you've mistaken me." After speaking, she turned around and left. But the moment she walked away, Gerald immediately chased after her. When they reached outside the exhibition hall, he grabbed her wrist with one hand and pulled her back to face him. Gerald was filled with the ecstatic joy of recovering something he had lost. "Where have you been all these years? Why did you hide and refuse to let me find you?" Paula's voice carried an extreme chill. "I'll say this one last time. My name isn't Paula. My name is Mia." Mia was the name she had taken after changing her identity. Apart from Lisa, who had known her for a long time, Everyone she met afterward called her by this new name. Paula warned him. I don't know you, stop bothering me. She wanted to leave, but Gerald refused to let her go. He gripped her wrist tightly, unwilling to release it no matter what, his eyes locking firmly onto her. You are clearly Paula. Why won't you admit it? Because she didn't want to have anything to do with him ever again. She didn't want him to appear in her life anymore. But Paula didn't say that out loud. Her face was cold and pale, and her tone carried a distant sharpness without the slightest politeness. Sir, I don't understand why you think you've mistaken me for someone else, but I truly don't know you, nor do I know the person you're talking about. No matter what. She refused to admit her identity. Her expression was filled with indifference toward him, completely unlike the Paula he remembered. Gerald couldn't help but frown deeply. Paula said coldly, That's enough. If you keep harassing me, I'll call the police. She forcefully pried his hand away and pulled her wrist free from his grasp. After that, Paula went to retrieve her car. Gerald stood there for a long time, frozen in place as he watched her drive away from the jewelry exhibition. Could it be that he had really mistaken her for someone else? He didn't believe it. If she wasn't Paula, how could her appearance and voice be exactly the same? Besides, 3 years ago he had already suspected that the explosion had been something she staged deliberately to escape from him. Over the past few years, he had tried to find her, but the world was too big and they were overseas. Trying to locate someone who had deliberately hidden her whereabouts among a sea of people was no different from searching for a needle in the ocean. Fortunately, perseverance paid off. After 3 years, he had finally run into her here. Chapter 19. Paula drove her car while putting on her Bluetooth headset and calling Lisa. After the call connected, Paula told Lisa honestly about running into Gerald at the jewelry exhibition just now. Lisa was shocked. That's such a coincidence. Is the world really that small? Paula sighed helplessly. Exactly. Neither of them had expected that one day they would run into Gerald in Italy. Paula added, The Ramos family is also in the jewelry business. Maybe he was invited by the organizer to attend this exhibition. The Ramos family was a giant in the jewelry industry. If the organizers had invited him to Italy, it wouldn't be surprising. But if she had known he was invited, she wouldn't have come to this exhibition. Lisa comforted her. You don't need to worry too much. Right now your identity is Mia, not Paula. As long as you firmly deny it, what can he do? Gerald has already concluded that this identity of mine is fake. If he investigates the identity of Mia, he'll quickly find out that I came to Italy 3 years ago. That will only make him more certain that I didn't die. That was indeed the truth. No matter how much she denied her identity, as long as Gerald investigated and made a few deductions, her denial would be useless. Paula frowned tightly. I'm not afraid of him recognizing me. What I'm afraid of is him finding out about Lydia. Once he knows Lydia exists, that will be the real trouble. Lydia was the child she had with Gerald 3 years ago. After careful consideration, Paula ultimately decided not to terminate the pregnancy and chose to give birth to the child. She didn't keep Lydia because she still had lingering feelings for Gerald. It was simply because Lydia was also her own child. She didn't have many relatives left around her, nor did she have any desire to start another relationship. She just thought that having her own child by her side would bring warmth to her heart and make her home feel livelier. If Gerald had never reappeared, then everything she had now would have been the life she had always dreamed of. But now that Gerald had appeared, Lydia's existence might not remain hidden. Once he discovered that Lydia was his daughter, Gerald would probably do everything possible to claim Lydia. The Ramos family would never allow their bloodline to remain outside the family. That was what worried Paula the most. Lisa thought for a moment. How about we send Lydia away for now, hide her somewhere so he can't see her? Maybe then everything will be fine. If he can find out that I came to Italy 3 years ago, it wouldn't be hard for him to ask around and learn that I have a daughter. You can hide it for a while, but not forever. That was true. Hiding Lydia wasn't really a good solution. Besides, Lydia was still very young. How could she possibly be separated from Paula? Paula frowned, her expression serious. We need to think of a way to make him believe that Lydia isn't his child. That way, the Ramos family won't be able to take Lydia away. After hearing this, Lisa suddenly came up with an idea. Then let's ask my brother. Your brother? Let him pretend to be Lydia's father. Make Gerald think Lydia is the child you had with my brother. That way he won't be able to take Lydia away. Paula hesitated. Is that really okay? Wouldn't it be unfair to Liam? Lisa laughed. Don't worry about that. My brother doesn't have a wife or a girlfriend. And he doesn't like anyone either. He's just a single guy who spends all day in the lab. It won't affect him at all. He's watched the two of us grow up together. And he knows all about your situation. If I just mention it to him, he'll definitely help you. Chapter 20. After Paula left the jewelry exhibition, Gerald did not chase after her immediately. Instead, he went to the exhibition organizer. This jewelry exhibition was extremely prestigious. Without an invitation from the organizer, unrelated people could not enter. Those who attended were either top brands in the industry or members of powerful and influential families. Therefore, it was very easy for Gerald to obtain information about Paula from the organizers. The organizer said, "That young lady is the boss behind DK Jewelry and its main designer. Her name is Mia. She was specially invited by us to participate in this exhibition." Gerald had known about the jewelry brand DK for quite some time, but he didn't expect that the boss behind this brand was actually her. He was quite surprised, but after thinking about it for a moment, he quickly felt that it wasn't strange at all. Paula had originally studied jewelry design. She had once been the chief designer under the Ramos Corporation. Now that she had established a company of her own, it was only natural. Because of this, Gerald became even more certain that she was Paula. Mia was merely the name she had adopted after coming here. With this information, it was no longer difficult to investigate Paula. Very soon, Gerald learned that she had come to Italy 3 years ago, and he also discovered that she had a daughter. However, no one knew who the child's father was. No one had ever seen him. Gerald immediately assumed that the child was his, because 3 years ago, when Paula left, she had been carrying his child. She hadn't died. She was still alive, and she had even given birth to their child. Gerald was overjoyed. Unable to suppress the happiness and excitement surging inside him, he completely pushed everything else out of his mind. After learning where she lived now, he rushed over first thing the next morning without stopping. However, when he arrived at the apartment where Paula lived, he hadn't even had time to knock on the door. At that moment, the apartment door opened in front of him. Paula appeared in his sight, dressed in a casual beige suit. Paula. Gerald's face lit up with joy as he stepped forward, but in the next second, he saw a man wearing refined glasses standing beside her, holding a 2- or 3-year-old child. Gerald was stunned, his eyes widening in shock. He looked at Paula, then at the man beside her, and heard himself ask, "Who is this man?" Paula glanced at Liam beside her. Before she could speak, Liam explained first, "I'm her husband." "And who might you be?" "Husband?" Gerald felt as if someone had punched him hard in the chest. Confusion immediately filled his mind as he stared at her. "Is he really your husband?" Paula said calmly, without emotion. "Other than my husband, who else would appear in my apartment so early in the morning?" Gerald froze completely, his mind going blank. Paula said coldly, "And sir, why are you standing outside my apartment door?" Beside her, Liam, still holding Lydia, asked, "Do you know this stranger?" Paula replied indifferently, "I met him once at the exhibition yesterday. He insisted that I looked like someone he knows." Liam nodded as if he understood. "I see." Gerald watched their back-and-forth conversation as though he were nothing more than an unrelated stranger. It felt as if something were stuck in his chest, making it difficult for him to breathe. He stared at her steadily. "You are clearly Paula. Why won't you admit it?" Paula frowned, about to speak, but Gerald interrupted first. "I've already investigated everything. No matter how much you deny it, it's meaningless." Chapter 21. Paula had already guessed things would turn out like this. Having prepared herself mentally, she remained calm and unflustered when she heard his words. She said to him in a calm and indifferent tone, "No matter who I am now, it has nothing to do with you anymore." Gerald's pupils froze slightly. How could we have nothing to do with each other? What relationship do we still have? Don't tell me Mr. Ramos has forgotten that we've already been divorced for a long time. And now, I also have a new marriage and family. A new marriage and family. Those few words were like knives stabbing into his heart. Gerald endured the pain in his chest and looked at Lydia in Liam's arms. No matter what relationship you have with this man, at the very least, we already have a child together. Paula, come back with me. Let's go back to South City. Before he could even finish speaking, Paula's voice grew even colder. This child has nothing to do with you either. Nothing to do with me? This isn't your child. The baby from 3 years ago no longer exists. Gerald simply refused to believe it. Without even thinking, he said, "You're trying to lie to me again. This child is clearly ours. 3 years ago, she had deceived him with a fake death and disappeared without a trace. For all these years, he had heard nothing about her and had nowhere to find her. And now she wanted to deceive him again, saying this child wasn't his? No matter what, Gerald would never believe that the child had nothing to do with him. He wasn't a fool who could be fooled by her words alone. He forced a smile. Paula, stop lying to me. This child must be mine, and can only be mine. Paula frowned in displeasure. Suddenly Gerald stepped forward, trying to snatch Lydia from Liam's arms. Give me my child. Liam held Lydia tightly and stepped back before Gerald's hand could reach her, preventing him from touching the little girl. Liam spoke unhappily. I already said this child has nothing to do with you. If you want to cause trouble here, don't blame us for calling the police to remove you. She's my child. What's wrong with me wanting to hold my own daughter? Gerald stared at the little girl in Liam's arms. She was pink-cheeked and delicate, her small face soft and adorable, with incredibly beautiful eyes. Just looking at her made his entire heart soften. But Paula snapped angrily. How many times do I have to say it? This child has nothing to do with you. Stop trying to lie to me, Paula. At her age, it perfectly matches the timing of our child. If she's not my daughter, whose could she possibly be? As he spoke, Gerald tried once more to take Lydia from Liam. Give me my daughter. His daughter was so adorable, yet she was being held in another man's arms. How could Gerald possibly tolerate that? But of course Liam had no intention of handing Lydia over to him, and so the two men nearly started fighting over a 2-year-old child, the tension between them reaching the breaking point, until the little girl in Liam's arms suddenly burst into tears and cried out for her mother. Mommy! She was too young to understand what was happening. She only felt that the scene in front of her was frightening. Paula quickly comforted the timid little girl and glared angrily at Gerald. Are you done yet? Do you have to scare the child into tears? The little girl's crying made Gerald feel helpless. He immediately didn't dare move forward to continue grabbing her. At a loss, he tried to explain. Paula cut him off directly. Since you insist on believing that Lydia is your child, fine, wait here. She turned and walked back into the apartment. In less than 5 minutes, she came out again holding 2 items. Paula slapped the 2 things into his hands. This is the consent form for the abortion surgery I had 3 years ago, and the bottle contains Lydia's hair. You can take it for a DNA test and see for yourself whether she is your daughter. Chapter 22. After handing everything to Gerald, Paula went into the elevator with Liam and Lydia and left. Gerald stood there in a daze, holding the items in his hands. On the abortion surgery consent form issued by the hospital, Paula's name was written clearly, along with the date from 3 years ago. Apart from that consent form, there was one more thing, hair sealed inside a glass bottle. Gerald held those 2 items and remained frozen in place for a long time. They took the elevator down to the underground parking garage and got into the car. Liam drove, while Paula and Lydia sat in the back seat. Paula looked at Liam in the front and said sincerely, I really troubled you this time. Liam, making you come all the way here to act out the scene with me. Liam drove steadily and smiled. It's nothing. You and Lisa are such good friends. Helping you out a little is no big deal. No need to be polite with me. Paula nodded and didn't continue with too much formal courtesy. Then she said, later, just drop me and Lydia off at the company and go back to the lab. After that, you won't need to keep running over here to act with me. Liam glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Are you sure that consent form and the hair can fool him? Paula was close with Lisa, so Liam also roughly knew the full story of what had happened between her and Gerald. Paula wasn't sure whether she could fool Gerald. That abortion consent form was something she had prepared 3 years ago. It was in case Gerald ever found out about Lydia's existence, so she could produce proof that she hadn't kept the baby. As for the strand of hair, it naturally wasn't Lydia's. Paula pressed her lips together. It depends on whether Gerald chooses to believe it. If he doesn't, I'll think of another way. But no matter what, I won't let him take Lydia away. Lydia was her daughter. From the moment she decided to give birth, she had already made up her mind that she would not let Lydia have anything to do with the Ramos family. Liam, of course, knew how important Lydia was to her. He thought for a moment. I think I should stay by you and Lydia's side for a while, just in case something happens and you can't handle it alone. Paula was startled. But wouldn't that be too? Liam smiled. Given our relationship, you don't need to worry about troubling me. And you don't need to worry about delaying anything for me. There isn't much going on in my lab recently. I have time. After a brief pause, he looked at her in the rearview mirror. And besides, I already said I'm your husband. If I show up for one day and then disappear, no one would believe it. If we're acting, we have to act it all the way through. At the very least, we should keep it up until Gerald leaves and stops coming to bother you. Only then would she and Lydia be free from Gerald's harassment. Since he put it that way, Paula didn't refuse again. She said gratefully, "Then thank you." When they arrived at the company, Paula invited Liam to go inside and sit for a while. Liam nodded in agreement. He stayed in the reception area, patiently playing with Lydia, while Paula worked in her office. At noon, Lisa came to the company to see her. Seeing Liam patiently playing with Lydia, Lisa's eyes shifted slightly. She turned and asked Paula, who was behind her desk, "What do you think of my brother?" "He's pretty good." "Why?" Lisa suddenly leaned halfway over Paula's desk and winked at her. "Then why don't you consider him?" Paula was stunned. "What nonsense are you talking about?" "I'm not talking nonsense. I'm seriously asking you this." Chapter 23. Although Lisa spoke with a serious expression, Paula still felt that she was joking. Paula laughed lightly. "Isn't it a bit inappropriate for you to suddenly start playing matchmaker like this? You're single, and my brother is single too. What's inappropriate about that?" Paula shook her head helplessly, not wanting to respond to that. But Lisa kept pestering her, curious and gossiping. "Is there something about him that you don't like?" "It's not about liking or disliking him. It's just that you and Liam have known me since we were kids. To me, he's practically like half a brother." She had always treated Liam like a brother and had never had any other thoughts about him. Lisa pouted. "He's not your real brother. It's totally fine to consider it. Besides, you're both people I know and understand very well. If you two got together, I'd feel more at ease." Liam's relationship history is very clean, unlike mine. Liam was actually quite handsome in a refined way and had never lacked admirers. Yet his romantic life was completely blank. He had never even had a girlfriend. Meanwhile, she was already divorced and had a daughter. Lisa snorted. "So what if you've been divorced and have a child?" "My brother isn't the kind of person who cares about that. Just try dating him. If it doesn't feel right, you can always break up." "But if Liam and I dated and then broke up because it didn't work out, wouldn't it be awkward for us to meet again afterward?" "Stop getting these ideas." If Liam heard this, it would make things very awkward for both of us. Faced with Lisa's persistent matchmaking, Paula simply shook her head stubbornly. She felt that things were good just the way they were and didn't want to change the comfortable relationship they currently had. Lisa sighed helplessly. "All right, since you've said that, I can't force you to accept him." Seeing her give up, Paula secretly let out a sigh of relief. But then Lisa suddenly blinked mysteriously. "There's something you might not know." "What?" Lisa glanced at Liam, who was playing with Lydia not far away. Then she leaned close to Paula's ear and whispered, "Actually, my brother has liked you for a long time." Her casual remark made Paula's heart jolt as she looked at her in shock. Lisa whispered, "I only found out recently. I accidentally came across his diary. That's why I wanted to ask whether you'd consider trying to date him." The fact that Liam liked her was something Paula had never imagined and never noticed. At first, she thought Lisa was joking, but given their relationship, Lisa had no reason to lie about something like that. So from that day on, Paula no longer knew what kind of attitude she should take when facing Liam. When she knew nothing, she could easily treat him like a brother or friend, but now that she knew Liam had secretly liked her for many years, the feeling when interacting with him became completely different. 2 days passed like that. Then Gerald showed up again, using business cooperation as an excuse. He appeared in the company's reception room, When Paula saw him, her brows furrowed deeply. Gerald stood up from the sofa, his expression complicated as he asked, "Is Lydia really not my daughter? You've already seen the abortion consent form, and you've already taken her hair to do a DNA comparison, haven't you?" Gerald had indeed done the DNA test. He couldn't quite describe what he was feeling, but I still don't believe it. Besides, that hair wasn't taken from Lydia's head in front of me. Paula looked at him coolly. So what, you want me to pull out another strand of her hair right in front of you and let you do another paternity test before you'll finally give up? Chapter 24. Gerald felt a dull pain in his chest from the cold tone of her voice. Paula looked at him calmly and said, "If you insist. Fine, I'll bring Lydia here right now and take a strand of her hair in front of you." She made a move as if she were about to bring Lydia over, looking completely unconcerned about letting him conduct another paternity test. But in truth, Paula felt extremely uncertain. She was simply gambling. She was gambling that Gerald believed the DNA test he had already done was real. She was gambling that Gerald believed she truly wasn't afraid of letting him do another test. Just as she turned and walked to the door of the reception room, Gerald pressed his lips together and suddenly spoke in a defeated voice. "No need." The moment she heard those words, Paula knew she had won the gamble. Inside, she quietly let out a long breath of relief. But soon after, she heard Gerald say again, "Paula, come back to South City with me." Without even thinking, Paula rejected him coldly and decisively. "I already have a husband and a child. It's impossible for me to go back to South City with you." Gerald walked over to her side. "We were together for 5 years. I don't believe that there isn't even the smallest place for me in your heart." Paula frowned, about to say something, but he spoke first. "I don't care what kind of relationship you have with that man, and I don't care whether Lydia is my child or not. Come back with me. Let's remarry and start over." Gerald gazed at her deeply, his eyes filled with warmth and pleading. "Ever since you left 3 years ago, there hasn't been a single day when I forgot you. I've been thinking about you constantly, so much that I'm almost going crazy. Paula, come back with me. I swear that in the future I will treat you well and never let you suffer even the slightest grievance again." Paula's lips moved slightly. At that moment, Lydia's voice suddenly sounded. "Mommy." Paula turned her head toward the sound and saw Liam walking toward the reception room, holding Lydia's hand. Lydia was wearing a little princess dress. Liam, wearing his refined glasses and casual clothes, smiled at her. "It's lunchtime. Lydia asked me to bring her over so we can go eat together." Looking at her adorable daughter, Paula's heart softened. She was just about to walk toward them when suddenly her wrist was grabbed tightly by Gerald. Gerald pleaded anxiously, "Paula, come back to South City with me. I really can't live without you." He gripped her wrist tightly, afraid that if he let go, she would disappear once again. But Paula said coldly and distantly, "Gerald, we divorced 3 years ago. Now I have a husband and a daughter. I can't abandon my husband and daughter to go back to South City with you." He said hurriedly, "I don't mind if you bring Lydia back with you, but I mind." Paula pried open his fingers one by one, showing no emotion at all, and forcefully pulled her wrist out of his large palm. She said, "What we had ended a long time ago. Please stop bothering me." After speaking, she shook off his hand and walked away from him. Watching her walk toward Liam and Lydia, Gerald felt a pain in his chest so intense it seemed he could hardly breathe. His eyes gradually turned red. "Are you still blaming me for what Susie did 3 years ago?" Blaming him? Of course Paula had blamed him, resented him, and hated him back then, but now she had a successful career, a lovely daughter, and a happy, fulfilling life. Those things from the past no longer mattered to her. However, Gerald clenched his teeth and suddenly said, "Fine, for the harm I caused you 3 years ago, I'll pay it back to you." Chapter 25. As soon as the words fell, Gerald picked up the fruit knife from the coffee table in the reception room and stabbed it fiercely into his abdomen. Bright red blood immediately began pouring out from the wound. Paula and Liam both gasped in shock. "Gerald, what are you doing?" Blood quickly soaked through Gerald's suit. His face turned pale from the pain, yet he still managed to smile at her. "What I owed you, I've paid it back." Paula and Liam both thought he had completely lost his mind, afraid Lydia would be frightened. Liam quickly covered the little girl's eyes with one hand while taking out his phone with the other to call emergency services. Gerald had stabbed himself deeply, and before long the pain caused him to lose consciousness. When he woke up again, he was already in the hospital. Paula and Liam were standing nearby. Gerald lay on the hospital bed. The moment he opened his eyes and saw them, his gaze immediately fell on Paula. Paula. He tried to push himself up to sit, but Paula frowned and stopped him. You've lost a lot of blood. It's best if you lie still for now. The moment Gerald moved, intense pain shot through his abdomen, and the wound that had just stopped bleeding began to bleed again. He had no choice but to lie still. His face was extremely pale from blood loss. Looking at him like this, Paula felt complicated emotions she could hardly describe. Liam was good at reading the situation. In a low voice he said to Paula, "You two talk. I'll wait outside." Okay. Liam walked out of the hospital room, leaving only Paula and Gerald inside. She frowned. Why did you do that? Gerald's voice was hoarse. I wronged you in the past. I owed you too much. And that's why you became completely disheartened and left me. I just wanted to repay what I owed you. This was how he chose to repay it. Paula's eyes grew even darker. There's really no need. Don't ever do something like this again. Then will you forgive me and come back to South City with me? His gaze locked firmly onto her, filled with hope. Paula's expression remained calm. Gerald, no matter how many times you ask, and no matter what you do, my answer will remain the same. What we had is over. I won't go back with you. Her determined words hurt him even more than the wound in his abdomen. Gerald's eyes turned red as he pleaded almost humbly. Paula, I really can't live without you. It was you who failed to cherish what we had. Trying to win it back now has no meaning. His eyes reddened further, his voice tightening. Do you really not love me at all anymore? Paula's voice held no warmth. I stopped loving you a long time ago. His throat tightened. Paula said calmly. From the moment you used me to threaten Mrs. Ramos just to get Susie released, my feelings for you disappeared completely. There was nothing left. Gerald's heart clenched violently, and it felt as if all the strength had suddenly drained from his body. I truly don't love you anymore. Gerald, this is where it ends for us. Once, she had loved him for a very long time. Now, she truly didn't love him anymore. After Paula left the hospital room, Gerald lay on the bed, letting silent tears slide down his face like an empty shell that had lost its soul. During the 3 years without her, he had lived like a walking corpse, his life dull and meaningless. Only after meeting her again and seeing her alive had his world seemed to light up once more. But no matter how humbly he begged, she refused to turn back. Was this the punishment he deserved? Meanwhile, Paula left the hospital with Liam. He drove her back to the apartment building. After the car stopped, she opened the door to get out. Paula, Liam called. She turned back. What is it? Liam looked at her beautiful face, finally gathering his courage. He picked up the bouquet of flowers he had prepared earlier in the back seat. Holding the flowers out to her, Liam spoke with complete sincerity. I like you. Paula froze. Suddenly she remembered what Lisa had said earlier, that Liam had liked her for a long time. Liam smiled gently. You might not believe it, but I've liked you for many years. I just never told you because Lisa once said you had a crush on Gerald. Later, when she married Gerald, he had even less of a chance. Eventually he had given up and focused entirely on his research. Then 3 years ago, she divorced Gerald. For all these years, I didn't confess because I was afraid you still had feelings for Gerald. But today at the hospital, when I realized he's completely gone from your heart, I wanted to fight for a chance for myself. Paula was caught off guard by the sudden confession. Liam, I'm divorced, and I have a child. Liam spoke gently. Lydia is very adorable, and I like her very much too. Whether or not you agree to be with me, I will treat her like my own daughter. Paula fell silent, unsure how to respond. I understand your concerns. I know Lydia is still very young, and you may not be thinking about remarriage right now, but I want you to know that my feelings aren't something temporary or impulsive. I sincerely want to take care of you and Lydia for the rest of my life. If possible, I hope you can give me a chance to try. We don't have to get married. We can just start by dating. If later you feel it's not right and want to separate, I will completely respect your decision. Liam spoke with sincerity and honesty. They hadn't known each other for just a day or two. Paula understood his character very well. After divorcing Gerald, Paula had never imagined that she would never fall in love again in her lifetime. Slowly, she smiled. Then, let's try. Liam's lips curved into a gentle smile. Thank you, Paula.